Hey, what's up? Hello, everyone. Welcome into Fantasy Filmball, the show where we turn movies into sports and sports into something we don't talk about here. My name is Matt.
My name is Dyl. Join us for our 2024 Best Picture Revisiting series where we will return to all 10 nominees, talk about their nominations, their snubs, and our overall thoughts of the films. And we have reached our 10th and final episode. We're talking about one of the biggest movies of the year, both in terms of audience and critics, and it's currently steamrolling the award season. And that's why we're ending with it, because it's most likely going to win Best Picture. But as always, we are welcoming in a guest today.
Not just most likely, it is steamrolling, but yes, welcome in Austin. Welcome back. Austin, if you aren't following, is a part of our Filmball game, our Filmball League. So we're really happy to have you here today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here talking about my favorite movie of last year.
I know, you should be honored. You get the big one. This is the big boy, the big chonker of a movie. So yeah, we of course always title these videos, Can Blank Win Best Picture? So let's talk about that. Can Oppenheimer win Best Picture?
Don't know.
Duh. Yeah, of course it can win Best Picture. But I'll start this by just saying I'm going to take my L right now. I'm going to take the big loss of a called shot, which is that I maintained for like 6 months that something was going to come out of nowhere and dethrone Oppenheimer. You know, I'm a big believer of the frontrunner fatigue theory, that it's really, really hard to stay a frontrunner all season long. And I was kind of expecting this one to die out at some point and be replaced by an underdog, as we've seen year after year after year after year, over and over. You get a movie that is usually from someone that has not been in the spotlight before, and it didn't happen this year. Oppenheimer steamrolled. So I just want to know what happened. Like, what makes this different from years past, with like 2019, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood dying out so fast, or The Irishman, or any of those other movies?
Yeah, we've talked about this in the past. We've talked about the stat of, like, I think with the exception of Birdman, like almost every movie winner in the last preferential era has been a director who hasn't directed a Best Picture nominee before. And everything about Oppenheimer screamed like, yeah, it's going to fall off at some point. Like, it was the front runner since what, July? And
yeah, since it premiered, everyone's like, this is winning Best Picture.
Yep.
And very rarely can a film sustain that.
Yeah, it's crazy. It just never fell off. Just had the juice all along.
I will differ from you a little bit, Matt. I thought, kind of like we just said there, from when it first premiered, all the signs were here. It checks off all your boxes of what you typically say the exception has to be, where it has to be a director's best reviewed film, their biggest film, and the fact that it was sweeping so many awards at that time, and then throughout the season, more awards started to propel its head. Like, yeah, it's going to win supporting actress, it's going to win actor. It's not just text and director, where it ultimately kind of sealed this race up, I would say, as early as July, but definitively after Venice, because while Poor Things didn't get acclaim, it wasn't universal acclaim. And I think that's where the race kind of fully stopped its head, because at that point, TIFF screens, I think, had started. So we had heard American Fiction, but also American Fiction's peak would have been winning, Screenplay in picture, and that I don't think would have been enough to take down Oppenheimer. But I was really interested for this revisiting episode for Oppenheimer, because it was obviously my most favorite film of the year. It's my most anticipated film of the year. So, like, what would be my thoughts coming into this? Because I still remember all the way back to 2022 when the first teaser trailer came out in front of Nope, and I dragged my family to the first showing, making sure that we got there early just to see this minute-long teaser, and I was instantly hooked. Christopher Nolan, without a doubt, is one of my favorite filmmakers. He often makes my favorite films of their respective years. I mean, look at Tenet here recently, some of his others in the past. I just find them all just to be so engaging, not just on a physical audience level, but also on like a mental level as well. He kind of checks off all the boxes of what I want out of cinema. So this was my fourth watch of Oppenheimer, and I just didn't really know what to expect, because my first one was with Barbenheimer. Thought it floored me. My second one was in 35 millimeter, where I liked it, but I didn't love it as much as the first time. And then my third time back was in IMAX, and that one was my favorite watch of all three. So it's still my favorite film of the year. The first act is where some of my few issues do occur. It's still a 10 out of 10, so it's not that many issues, but I think that the movie gets a little bit to get going. We have the plot line of Oppenheimer as well as Strauss's takedown, where I don't think they mix as well at the start, but as soon as we get to Los Alamos, all of my issues go out the window. The pacing from that point just keeps going and going. I love the cross-cutting between timelines. Like I said, the editing just moves you so fast between this 3-hour film, and it's kind of weird that a 3-hour film is one of the quickest viewing experiences you have in a year, but that truly is how I feel about Oppenheimer every time I watch it. And when we hit that last hour with the trial, I think I just become absolutely riveted by this story, and it just all comes together so perfectly. And overall, Oppenheimer is just a truly magical film to me. It just delivers on all fronts, fantastic performances. It's one of the most engaging films since I've started getting into film in recent memory. And yeah, the script does have some corny lines of dialogue, but they work for me. And I think Oppenheimer will go down as one of the best picture winners of all time.
Yeah, I agree. I would say if I had to pick one of the 3 acts, I would say the first act is probably the weakest. Mm-hmm. Just kind of setting up like his background, his early life, his relationships. But I think the movie just gets better and better as it goes along. Like that second act, the whole Manhattan Project is just, it's like a heist film. It's like getting the team together and just so fun to watch everything come together. And then I don't understand the people who say that the third act is slow or weak, because that's the best part of the movie to me, is when the full weight of what he's done finally hits him and it becomes almost like a horror movie. I love the way he kind of bends genres with this movie, and that's part of the reason why it's been such a successful hit with both critics and audiences.
Yeah, I'm gonna come in on the lower side. I like this movie. I do. I think it's good, but to me, I've been a little disappointed all year long in Oppenheimer, just because Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker that, got me into movies. I fell in love with movies because of Inception. I think many people my age who are really into movies now, Christopher Nolan was probably the gateway drug to be like, oh, movies can be more than just like cartoons and action. And I've always loved and appreciated him for that. But I do think my anticipation for Oppenheimer, it dropped a little bit after Tenet. When Tenet was coming around, that was one of my most anticipated movies of 2020. I remember going to the IMAX Cinesphere, the world's first IMAX theater in Toronto, to see multiple Christopher Nolan movies in early 2020, and they all came with that 10-minute sequence from Tenet. I was so excited. And then I was a little disappointed by Tenet. It's fine, but I started to see some of the flaws, some of the things that I'd waved off for years whenever people criticized Christopher Nolan. I saw them here. And then going back to some of his other films, I started to see them there. And then I got a little bit less excited for Oppenheimer. And when it came out, I saw it opening day. I was pumped to see it. But there was something about it, even in the trailers, that I was like, I'm not as excited about this movie as I should be. As I normally would be for a Christopher Nolan movie. And I felt the same way about the movie as I did the trailer. It was good, but I just didn't get excited by it in the same way, and upon a rewatch, how I felt was the line that's said over and over in the movie: theory can take you only so far. This is a perfect movie in theory, but theory can only take you so far. And that's why, overall, this is a masterfully crafted film. It moves like clockwork. Every element is in the right place. Everything is precisely calculated to do exactly what it's supposed to do. In a film about how scientific theory can only paint part of the picture and the rest of the picture is human emotion and human impact, I found it a little ironic that I find this movie to be stone cold perfection on a formal level and yet completely unemotional. I don't feel a single thing watching this film. And yes, it is very well made, very well crafted, but to me, I just find it a little disappointing that this is the movie Christopher Nolan is going to be winning the Oscar for. I mean, Dylan, you say this is going to be one of the best Picture winners of all time. On a personal level, I would actually say this is my least favorite of the decade so far.
That's
behind
harsh.
Coda.
That's harsh. Wow. I don't even
But I
hate
like
Coda.
it. But I like it. I think that this is a decent 8 out of 10, but from a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, who has delivered 7 10 out of 10 movies for me, it's really disappointing when I see people saying that his best film ever made is a film that I think is a decent 8 out of 10.
I guess that's fair, coming at it from like a different perspective if I wasn't someone who loved this film, but I guess that segues into Christopher Nolan's Best Director nomination, where he's most likely going to be walking away with the win. I think he's a master of his craft. Matt, you just mentioned he has 7 10 out of 10s. For me, I don't know if I would say 7, but he's made some of my favorite films of their respective years, like I've said before. And we've seen him take on action. We've seen him take on sci-fi. We've seen him take on drama. We've seen him take on thrillers. And I think that he kind of mixes them all together pretty seamlessly, pretty perfectly here in Oppenheimer for a biopic. And I think we get those elements, like Austin mentioned before, that are very horror-esque with the thrills of them all in that last act. I think just the way your emotion, or maybe not emotion, but your heart races during the Los Alamos section of like, will this work? Obviously, if you've read a history book before, you know it works, but like in the film, you're so engrossed in the story, and I just feel that comes from Nolan's direction, where I would agree. Is this the movie of all his movies I would pick to say winning Best Director? No, but the movie I would pick, everyone would really disagree with me about the one that I would pick. But I just think his direction here is so great, and I mean, it goes back to the conversation we had on Poor Things with Yorgos Lanthimos, and tying that back to like Villeneuve and Dune and other directors throughout history. When you have a film that's crafts are just all so phenomenal from top to bottom, that ultimately goes back at the director at the end of the day for being the one with the idea, with the one of bringing all these people together. Kind of like Oppenheimer in the film, you bring together so many great minds, you're going to have a great outcome.
I guess I'll say, in terms of Christopher Nolan's direction, I mean, I mentioned it before, he's a formal master, and that mastery is at play here. There's this tense, very... the pace just goes and goes and goes. And that really takes someone who understands the craft. And you can tell every scene is planned to perfection. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, because this is actually one of my problems with the movie. I think it's too planned. It doesn't feel natural or real enough. And Christopher Nolan, you know, he mostly has made action movies. And in an action movie, you can really get away with everything feeling like clockwork, feeling like pieces of a puzzle, where it just fits perfectly, and it's satisfying in a movie like Interstellar or Inception, or fuck it, even Tenet. It's really satisfying when those pieces fall into place. It feels good. But in a movie, like a drama like this, sometimes it feels a little too convenient for me. Sometimes it feels a little bit inauthentic. It doesn't feel like real life, I guess, is how I'd say it. But I guess for me, the main thing, again, formal mastery. I don't love how he frames Oppenheimer almost like a superhero. I feel like at times it's, despite the fact that the one of the themes in the movie, Kitty says it at one point, which is you don't get to commit the sin and then ask people to feel sorry for you when there are consequences. That's a major theme of the movie. But I do think that the film is a little bit asking us to pity him, to feel sorry for him, as though he was treated unfairly. I don't know. I feel like there are some things that don't quite work about the direction for me.
I agree with that sentiment. However, I think the film is kind of making that its point of how the American people kind of made Oppenheimer as a superhero after the bomb. He's the one who won them the war. He gets on the cover of Time magazine. And then since this film is from Oppenheimer's perspective, he's the one who wants pity. That's why he lets them in the trial rip him to shreds, in the words of Kitty. And it's like, I get those arguments, but I also kind of think that's what the film is trying to do. So I respect your opinion of like, oh, I don't like that. So that just goes to not liking what the film's direction is, but I feel like that was the point of like the direction, for lack of terms. But Austin, how do you feel about Christopher Nolan's nomination?
I think it's a great nomination. I would agree that this is not the one I would reward him for, but I do think that this movie kind of brings together a lot of the elements that he's been building towards throughout his career. It feels like he finally pulled everything together. Obviously, on a technical level, the movie looks great, but I think just the tone of this movie is also perfect throughout. I don't know if you guys have heard this interpretation that this movie is almost like an apology from Nolan for making the superhero genre so popular. And I think
I have heard that, yeah.
It reminded me of The Fabelmans a little bit, where it's almost like he's saying, like, I can't turn that part of my brain off. That's just the way that I, like, process making movies. Like, having the whole, like, suit up sequence with Oppenheimer putting on the thing and walking out like the sheriff into the town, and it feels like he's intentionally doing callbacks to the superhero genre. At least that was my interpretation. I don't know if you guys agree.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I guess that's what I'm not entirely sure if I feel that was the right approach, but it definitely does feel intentional. And again, he's a master. And again, he's a master at work, and every single thing that happens in this movie is intentional and it's precise. There is not one misstep here. Everything is exactly the way that Nolan wants it to be.
Well, we talked about in American Fiction how Jeffrey Wright's an actor that we've known and we've loved in his various supporting roles. Cillian Murphy is another perfect example of that, of someone who we've seen throughout Nolan's catalog, and here, and what you could call Nolan's culmination, is getting that leading chance. And I just think he kind of perfectly portrays every stage of Oppenheimer through his journey. We see the ambition early on before the bombs dropped of how he's a man with something to prove. While there's a lot of people out there who don't really like him, we can kind of see that like peer through his character, where he's always looking out for himself, taking advantage of people, just doing what he wants in the moment. But then we also see his charisma and his egotism shine. That shows like, hey, he can kind of back up his word. And then kind of what Austin was talking about, where the third act, he's kind of regretting a lot of his choices and he's seeing the horror. And I think that Murphy, maybe it's the IMAX cameras close up in his face, but we can really see the emotion come through his character and his tone and his physical acting, as well as in his verbal acting. And again, Murphy would probably not be my favorite pick of the year, but I think he would be a great winner, especially for these biopic winners that we tend to get very often. I don't think, kind of like Maestro, where this is the traditional biopic from cradle to grave, where we get to see like every stage of his life. It's very much hammering in these few decades, and just I think Murphy is doing so much while also not like overdoing it at the same time.
Yeah, and to Matt's point too, I think, like, I get the argument that this movie is kind of like emotionally distant. I think the writing is kind of intentionally has to be that way, because we don't really know what his internal thought process was. We kind of just have to interpret that ourselves. But I think Cillian Murphy's performance really adds a lot just to the nonverbal aspect of his performance. There's so much he does with his face that makes us read more into the lines that he's saying verbally.
But in terms of Cillian Murphy, it's a very quiet, measured performance, and I was kind of struck on this watch how little I got from him. It's a powerful performance, but he's not giving a lot. Lines are whispered. I actually end up kind of laughing at one point when I realized just how often there are scenes outside where the wind is blowing like crazy, and Cillian Murphy is delivering dialogue like this to someone who is 20 feet away.
There's one with Benny Safdie like that I noticed as well.
Hilarious. Like the amount of times that I noticed, like, they are whispering into the camera. They would not be able to hear each other. But honestly, Cillian Murphy is really, really good in this movie. And he's just doing so little and saying so much with that little. Now, would I give him the Best Actor award? I think I do prefer some of the other performances, but his work is very, very strong, and he is perfectly cast for this role. Now, someone that I was even more surprised was very pulled back, very restrained, is Robert Downey Jr. Not the actor that you think of when you think subtle. I've never associated those two, but on a rewatch, I was really, really struck by the snake-like essence of his performance as Louis Strauss. It's just so sneaky. It embodies the line that he says at the end. Power stays in the shadows, and the whole performance is just shadowy, shadowy, sneaky. He is ready to backstab just to get ahead at any point in time. And even the way that he speaks sometimes, he has this cadence that sounds snake-like. It's really, really well done, and I'm so surprised that Robert Downey Jr. was the one to pull it off this way.
Yeah, I've got to admit, my first watch, like, I didn't really understand what everyone was talking about when they said, like, oh, he's going to win the Oscar for this. Like, I was like, he kind of, like, blends into the background for me, but once I rewatched it, I realized, like, he's, like, a menacing force in that background. Like, once you know what his motivations are, what he's actually thinking, like, he's, like, sinister. And it's, like you said, it's very subtle, very unlike Robert Downey Jr., but I also love, especially on rewatch, when you notice just like how much the little like microaggressions just get to him, just dig at his ego. Like, it's pronounced Strauss, like it's Admiral, it's not Mister. You know, just the little things you don't notice. A lowly
shoe salesman.
Yes, like no, just a shoe salesman. It's like you don't notice those things the first time, but you can see the seeds start to be planted on rewatch of why he decides to do what he does at the end.
Yeah.
Well, to amplify your point, he does say power stays in the shadows. But yeah, I think Robert Downey Jr. delivers his career best role. From everything that y'all just said, his snarkiness, his speech pattern is perfect for a character like Strauss. You fully buy and believe and honestly think that he is just so bent on Oppenheimer and thinks Oppenheimer has spent his whole career trying to tarnish Strauss, when in Oppenheimer's eyes, he's just this one guy I saw this one time. But yeah, I think RDJ is great. I still think it's crazy how, like, in retrospect, watching old prediction videos, going to stuff from early in the year, no one was expecting him to even be a force in the race. People would even have Oppenheimer winning picture or #1 for director, or even have Murphy winning, and they wouldn't even have Downey in their top 10. I think it's just so crazy how the trajectory changed as soon as this movie was saw. It wasn't like, oh, Oppenheimer's sweeping and he's coming along. It was like, no, Downey's winning and then Oppenheimer sweeping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a strange thing, but it's something that really speaks to how in these movies, specifically like biopics or historical films, you would never expect Louis Strauss to be one of the main characters of a film about J. Robert Oppenheimer. And even if you knew the story, there would be no way to read the cast list and go, oh, that's an Oscar-winning role, because you just think that it would be like a small part of the story, and yet it's like 25% of the movie is just like through the eyes of Strauss.
You know what it reminds me of? Moving away from film but going over to theater. It's like Hamilton, where, like, if you know the story of Hamilton, you don't think of Burr being like the second in cast, but how that's basically a co-lead situation. Burr thinks his whole life Hamilton's out to get him, when actually Hamilton's like, I thought we were boys, I never saw it this way. So like, I think that's I never thought of that till just right now, but like, yeah, situations where
100% right. No, I love that comparison. It's the same as Amadeus. It's Mozart and Salieri. It's the competition, the rivalry, where one rival is completely unaware that there is a rivalry going on. And how do we recontextualize the story of a historical figure's life through the viewpoint of another historical figure who just has a fucking bone to pick? And I think that choice is really, really strong. You know, I've been very negative on this movie, but I think some of the choices made in how the story is framed is really, really exceptional. And I think making Strauss such a major force in the story, not just through Robert Downey Jr.'s performance, but through the structural choices made in the screenplay, I think it's one of the most inspiring parts of this film and why the movie has gone so far.
I want to say, too, to that point, real quick. One of the themes I noticed on this rewatch was, I think, you know, Christopher Nolan's always had like a great appreciation, I think, for the scientific community. Mm-hmm. But in this movie, you really feel like there's like a brotherhood within that community. Like, they all have each other's backs. Like, you talked about the Warner Brothers thing, Matt. Like, I feel like Nolan sort of sees himself in that mold of like the creative type. And like, I remember so Rami Malek's character really stood out to me on rewatch, because when he's set up to speak at the Senate confirmation hearing, like, you think that he's going to be like Strauss. He's going to, because every time we saw him before that, like, Oppenheimer was like belittling him and like knocks a clipboard out of his hand, and you think he's going to be vindictive like Strauss, but then he comes to Oppenheimer's rescue and totally rebukes Strauss. And I think that speaks to that sort of community of feeling like you have each other's backs, and I think that's a very important part of this movie.
Completely agreed. Yeah, it's a thematically layered movie, which is something I appreciate more and more about it every time I watch. Yeah, like I kept hearing lines being dropped and being like, "Ooh, that's a theme. That's one of the themes right there. That's good." But to talk about the screenplay, I mean, we've been talking about 4 categories: picture, director, actor, supporting actor, where this movie is cleaning up all the way along the season, outside of, you know, one loose Paul Giamatti win at Critics' Choice. Everywhere else, this has won all of those categories. But the screenplay is something that is not winning anywhere. Even in places that shower this movie in love, it's not winning screenplay, which is really strange to me, because this is a very prototypical screenplay winner. This is 90% dialogue. And so it's so fascinating to me, like, why is this movie not winning when it's just talk for 3 hours? What do you guys think?
I think it kind of plays into a few different angles. I think one is, if you're awarding the film so much, sometimes you're just like, what's its weakest link? Let's move somewhere else with that. And I think screenplay is kind of unanimously agreed of Oppenheimer is your favorite of the year. Screenplay may not be your favorite aspect of it. I think parts of it could be to the corny dialogue I mentioned before, where it kind of works for people like me, but other people be like, this is so corny, I don't like it, and those people would move it down a little bit, as well as the way it's written. It's not written like a traditional script. It's all from a first person perspective, which could back off some voters, and may, like, if they're just reading the script, like, oh, this reads kind of weird. I like the screenplay. I think it has a lot of important aspects. You talk about its themes, its irrelevancy, what it's trying to say, and sometimes it's very abrupt, sometimes it's very in your face, but other times it's kind of in the background, and you kind of see it play out, especially once we hit those final acts. But yeah, I think Oppenheimer's screenplay is one of Nolan's best recently. I like Tenet more. Oppenheimer has a better script. I think Oppenheimer's script would be better than like Dunkirk, better than like the Dark Knight movies. I think this would be one of his best scripts that he's put out so far. It's just that thing where, like, if you're giving Nolan director, giving him picture, do we need to give him screenplay too?
Yeah, I think when a lot of people think of Christopher Nolan, they think of him as a director first and a writer second. Like, even if you look through his filmography, like, a lot of his best written movies are like co-written with his brother, I feel like. So that, like, I would agree that this is probably the best script he's written solo. But yeah, to Dylan's point, he's already winning director. Like, we've seen in the past with like Jane Campion and Chloe Zhao, they like to spread the love when you're guaranteed to win one award.
Yeah, I guess I'll speak to a little bit of my thoughts on the script, and then I want to hear your more positive thoughts, because I definitely came down a little bit harder on the screenplay this time. Now, I'll first say I think the choice to write it in first person is so inspired, and I hope that we see more scripts like that, because it is a very expressive way to tell a story. Actually, Austin, I'd love to hear what you think, because you are a screenwriter. What do you think about the choice to write it in first person and the inevitable wave of films that are going to be coming written that way?
I mean, I love it as a creative choice. It's super unique, and like, I've read the screenplay. It reads like no other screenplay I've ever read. I also think he can get away with it because he's an established filmmaker, and if I tried to write a first-person script and sell it, it would not go anywhere. People would be like, "What the hell are you doing, man?" Like, it's funny because the more famous a director or writer is, usually the lower quality the writing is in the screenplay. Like, even this year, you look at some of the for your consideration scripts. There's typos and misspellings. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to see more scripts take chances like that. I think. I don't know. I wonder if they used it for the shooting script. I'm not sure. They might have changed it a little bit for that. But yeah, just as a creative choice, I think it was brilliant.
Something I guess I'd say about Christopher Nolan is I do primarily think of him as a writer. But writing is much more than dialogue. And where I think Christopher Nolan excels is in building structure in building situations and coming up with incredibly interesting plots. That's where Inception flourishes, that's where Interstellar flourishes, and that's where Dunkirk flourishes. He is a structuralist first and foremost, but he has always been a little bit weaker with dialogue. Dialogue has never been his strong suit. And so to me, for this to be a 3-hour-long movie that is 90% dialogue, that is a little bit of a weak point. And I do think structurally this film is just as interesting as Dunkirk, as Inception, as Interstellar. It is so well thought through, so well plotted out. But the way that it relies on dialogue does make it ultimately feel a little bit less strong in the writing to me. Especially, I really noticed on this watch how perfectly every scene ends, how every character has exactly the right thing to say at every single point in time. It feels like movie dialogue, which is not always a bad thing. It's stylish and it's fun to listen to, but there are times when even beyond the it's a young senator from Massachusetts, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, but beyond lines like that, I feel like a lot of scenes end with exactly the line that is needed to go right into the next scene. And that's the perfection that I'm talking about with Christopher Nolan. He likes the puzzle pieces to fit together, and that works so well in an action movie. And I find it to work a little bit less in a drama because it doesn't feel real. It feels perfectly planned.
It's funny you bring that up about the dialogue, because Denis Villeneuve's been in the news lately talking about dialogue. He got in some hot water for saying that he doesn't really consider dialogue that important, and I think that kind of got
though.
He is right. It was totally misconstrued because I think he and Nolan are similar in that they both view dialogue as like a means to an end. It's just to progress the story.
Film.
Exactly. I think that's when people think of screenwriting, they think of dialogue, but it's so much more than that. It's setting the tone, it's character development, it's all of that. And dialogue is just, the thing I've learned as a writer is dialogue is like it's the last thing you have to worry about. You got to make sure, like, if your dialogue's not working, it's because something else is wrong. The character's wrong, the setting. You got to work on everything else, and then the dialogue will take care of itself later. And I think both Nolan and Villeneuve take that approach.
Yeah, they're both very visual filmmakers, and that's why I always kind of balk when people are like, oh, Christopher Nolan's not a writer. He is. He's an exceptional writer. He is just not great at dialogue specifically, but there is so much more to a screenplay than just the dialogue. And that's actually, kind of why I'm not as big a fan of Oppenheimer as I am of Dunkirk or Interstellar or Inception. It's that, you have this filmmaker who excels so much at visual storytelling, who is now going back to relying on a theatrical form, on dialogue. It's a 12 Angry Men style film where it's just talking. And that's not what I think Nolan has ever shined at. But the film still works despite that. But one thing that does bug me about the script, and something that's been a recurring theme through Christopher Nolan's career, is his inability to write women. This has always been a problem through all of even his best movies. I can admit he cannot write female characters. And there are 2 or 3 female characters in this movie. And Emily Blunt got a nomination for a role that I think is severely underwritten, except for one scene. So I want to hear, what do you guys think about Emily Blunt? Obviously, she's been waiting decades to get her first nomination. Very happy she has it. But for this role?
Yeah, I would agree, because even though Christopher Nolan is one of my favorite filmmakers, that is definitely his weakness. And it's funny, because the scene that everyone's talking about with Emily Blunt when she's giving her deposition, I think that's like the one scene that Nolan didn't write himself. That was all taken directly from the transcript. So
oh, really? Holy shit!
Like, you can go in. Like, I think he took that all
from
the Prometheus, the American Prometheus book, which is pretty hilarious. But I would agree. I mean, I do think that she has an interesting arc throughout the story. She's like in the background, and obviously her performance, I think she does a lot with a little. So I'm okay with her nomination, just because, even though she is underwritten, you do feel her in the background, similar to Strauss. Like, whenever Oppenheimer is giving his deposition, she's there as like the emotional support in the background. And they have a very up and down relationship, very turbulent, but they're both grown-ups, like Oppenheimer says, and they walk through fire together, and she can overlook his flaws because she has flaws too. And I think there's that interesting through line throughout.
Yeah, I would agree with Austin where I do see the issues, but they are also part of the reason why it works. Going back to the script, from how this is from Oppenheimer's perspective, we're not going to get much of Kitty if he didn't really spend much time with Kitty, per se. I think that courtroom scene we've talked about numerous times is her highlight here, going to another nomination of America Ferrera. They each got in for one exceptional scene. Obviously, your variance on your likeliness of their nomination comes to how much you like that specific scene. But I think if you're upset about one, you got to be upset about both, sort of thing. But yeah, I personally wouldn't nominate her, but this year was so weak. And when you love a film like this, it's kind of easy to slide her in. I think she's perfectly fine. I think outside of that outside that deposition scene, she has other moments to shine. Like Austin was mentioning, while she is in the background, you see her reaction to certain phrases. You also see her throughout the earlier parts of the film when they first connect, they first grow, as well as that scene in the woods after Oppenheimer learns of his ex's passing, of how she basically tells him, you need to get yourself together. I think that honestly is on par with her deposition reaction in terms of either a clip or in terms of the overall goodness of her performance. But I mean, I think this whole ensemble shines. We've talked about Murphy, we've talked about Downey, we've talked about Blunt, but like everyone here is so good. And like if Oppenheimer picked up another supporting actor nomination, I wouldn't be upset. Matt Damon, I think it's way too much flack. I think he's really good in this role, where if supporting actor was in a weaker year, like the last 2 or 3 years, easy peasy, put him in the top 5. And then, I mean, just listing off names: David Krumholtz, Jason Clarke, Rami Malek, Casey Affleck, Alden Ehrenreich, Benny Safdie, Tom Conti. They all come in and get like 1-2 moments, but are so impactful in those moments. And that goes to casting, that goes to directing them. They each just rule so much in their specific roles.
Mm-hmm. I got to agree with that. The casting, if there was an award for casting, this would have to be the winner. It really would. Like, wow, the work done to fill all of those roles. I've kind of done a 180 on my opinion of the casting category, especially thinking about how Christopher Nolan used the cast here. There's such an art to how he cast big name actors in these roles, because there's so many faces and so many people who are just generic white men in 1940s clothing. And it would be so easy if all of these actors were unknowns to go, wait, who's that again? Wait, who? That, and that's who? Where did they fit into the story? Did they do that thing? Or that's the same. No, those are different people. But what he does by casting these faces that you recognize, even if you aren't too familiar with their work, you know the people. You know the faces. It differentiates people, and it creates an association with each of those characters, no matter how small the character is. Josh Peck shows up to push a button. You know it's Josh Peck. And that's what carries through the whole film. It does such work in, we don't need to spend time getting introductions for each of these characters, because we already have associations with these actors. Very, very inspired choice, and definitely takes a filmmaker the level of Christopher Nolan to be able to get a cast this good, and to be able to pull that off, because most people would not be able to book all of these actors.
And I think with Matt Damon in particular, like, I feel like he's kind of cursed in that any role he plays, people are always going to go, oh, that's Matt Damon, and not be able to really see him. But that kind of makes him the perfect Christopher Nolan actor, because that's what he's looking for. He's just looking for that instant association. Like, you recognize him immediately, and every time he's in a scene, you don't have to spend time thinking, like, which character was that again? Like, oh, this is Groves. Like we know.
Which general?
Yeah.
But instead, now you go, oh, it's Casey Affleck, and it's Matt Damon. And then there's the other ones that come in, and you recognize them. You know who they are. You know they're different.
And that plays with the editing as well, Matt, because you're talking about recognizing all these faces. The movie's moving so fast. We're cutting so much between these multiple timelines. Having those actors you recognize, whether they're gigantic names or just something that you've seen in that one movie that you loved from so long ago, that one TV show you grew up with. Like, you know exactly who they are, but talking about more of the specific editing itself, I love the cross-cutting here. I think the way it goes in between these two timelines is seamless once you get accustomed to it. Like I mentioned before, the first act, it is a little junky at first because you're like, oh, wait, we're here. Obviously, when you watch this film multiple times, it comes a little bit more natural, but at least on my first viewing, and even on this fourth viewing, there were a few times I'm like, okay, this isn't the most seamless transition where some of the other ones later on are exactly that. But when we get to Los Alamos, when they're trying to recruit everyone like Austin was talking about before, and especially during the trial at the end with the two trials at once, basically, I just think the editing there is phenomenal and makes a 3-hour film feel like it's an hour and a half.
With the non-linear storytelling, like I said, my first watch I was a little iffy on the movie just because it's kind of hard to wrap your head around everything. It's not the kind of movie you can watch just once and remember everything that happens, but the job that Jennifer Lame had to do with not only putting all those different storylines together, but just pacing it perfectly and making it feel almost like a thriller is very well done.
We talk a lot about the editing category not being best editing, but most editing a lot of the time. Because, so often we see these movies that, like Bohemian Rhapsody, that had the most cuts. Was it the best? Hacksaw Ridge, same thing. But sometimes good editing is also flashy. And that's what Oppenheimer is, in my opinion. Yeah, I've ragged a lot on this movie. I'm not going to say anything negative about the editing. I think it is a flawlessly edited film. And what I talked about with the puzzle pieces and the way Christopher Nolan has this complete control and mastery over every moment, that's in the edit. The edit is pitch perfect. The way it moves from scene to scene, I think is wonderful. Now, I guess I will say one thing that I find a little cheesy, and this may be in the script too, but there are a few moments very early on where it's like a montage of Oppenheimer like learning and becoming a more full person. That Can You Hear the Music montage I find so cheesy.
Can you hear the music, Robert?
Can you hear the music? And then it's like he's throwing a ball against the ground, and then he's looking at art, and it's like, oh, he's studying. He's becoming like a more cultured man. I was like, okay, all right. I'll give you this one, Chris. Just, oh my God.
Editing is usually paired with sound in terms of awards, and I think the sound here in Oppenheimer is pretty fantastic. Before I go into specifics about the sound, one thing I learned from a Q&A is how, because they filmed with IMAX cameras, almost every line of dialogue from this film is ADR, because you could hear the camera in the background of when they were recording. So especially on this rewatch, 'cause I didn't know that for my first 3 watches, but this time I was trying to point out oh, when do their lips not match up? And you don't really notice it ever. Matt, you make the point earlier where they're whispering or just briskly talking when it's supposed to be a loud scream. Those ones are kind of apparent, and maybe there's sometimes with the editing in that sequence where they're talking about where should we drop the bomb, where they're clearly cutting away from a face because they probably don't have it synced up. But outside of those, I think it's very seamless, and outside of a noise or the bomb or anything like that, I think that is a very strong suit of how good sound work can be in a film. But yeah, and other stuff with the movie, I think when this movie needs to be loud, it is loud where you can feel it. When this movie needs to be quiet, it is quiet where you can feel it. And I really, really like the sound work during the deposition scene or I guess it's not a deposition, but when Oppenheimer is being talked to get his security clearance. I think the sound work, especially later on, is very immersive because you can feel his growing nerves and his growing concern with how stuff is playing out as Jason Clarke's character continues just to grill him more and more throughout.
And I think the scene in the gymnasium is, I think, the best scene Christopher Nolan's ever done in his career. Just the sound work in that scene is incredible when he starts to have these hallucinations of the bomb dropping and girls screaming in the background, and it's
the way it cuts,
it's an incredible
the sound.
scene. Oh, and then just comes crashing back in. It's amazing.
I mean, I said earlier that I find this film to be totally unemotional, and I will stand by that with the exception of the 10 minutes around that scene. There's about right after he drops the bomb to the way that they hold him up with the American flag in the background and cheer him on, as you can just see that he's reckoning with what he's done. Incredible work. That's the one part of the movie that like moves me emotionally, is seeing his naivete there. So well done. But yeah, with the sound work, I think actually I'm not 100% on this, so I don't want to too confidently correct you, Dylan. But I think it's not ADR, it's wild lines, because I'm pretty sure what Christopher Nolan, like he doesn't want to do any ADR, which is why so often in his films there is like a lot of noise going on. But what he does, I think, is he will record a take with the IMAX cameras and then immediately be like, all right, now repeat exactly what you just did. We're going to roll sound. And there's no cameras. So they record the sound on set, but it's not the sound that's happening while the IMAX camera is going on.
Well, thank you for the correction. That's definitely what I meant to say and falsely labeled it as ADR.
They're very close, but it's just like terminology, I think. But yeah, it's such a fascinating technique that he does. But he wants everything to be captured on set, which is also in like the visual effects, all of that. But yeah, the sound is so strong here, and it doesn't fall into the typical Nolan trap of I can't hear shit. Even in the scenes where it gets loud and the score is booming, you can still hear every line of dialogue, which is definitely all the way back to The Dark Knight, Inception, Dark Knight Rises has always been a problem with him. And I think one of my favorite sequences in terms of sound is leading up to the Trinity test, where there's about 20 straight minutes where the score is just going and going and going and building, and the strings are shrieking little bit more by little bit more, and it just keeps growing and building, and it holds you and it never lets you go. I think if we're talking about the sound here, we have to talk about the score with it. So I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts about the score?
Yeah, going back to that montage you mentioned earlier, like, I love that montage. I know it's cheesy and all that, but a big part of the reason is just that score from Ludwig Göransson. The Can You Hear the Music sequence is just one of the best motifs since Interstellar, right, in my opinion.
I got to agree. Like, that music's gorgeous.
Ludwig's one of my favorite working producers, composers in the scene right now. I mean, I love this stuff with Community. Donald Glover's one of my favorite artists. He's produced most of his albums. And then his scores for Tenet and Black Panther have been right up my alley, and I think Oppenheimer is no different. Honestly, this may be his best of the bunch, barring Tenet. But I just think how this film's used so often, as you're talking about, Matt, where it is present throughout the whole film, but not present in like a detracting way, present in a way that it is adding to the sound design, adding into the pace of the film. And I just love how they use the instruments here, because it's not the instruments you would expect to be used, but they do them in such a way that is so, I don't want to say calming, but like it fits both the calm nature of what a score can be, as well as the intensity that you specifically need during like those Trinity scenes, during the deposition scene later on. Like, it just has the right note for the certain section of the film that you're currently at.
Yeah, sorry to be a Debbie Downer again. I'm not a huge fan of the score here. I know I just said that I love the way that the score is used. I think that there are like 5 or 6 scenes in this that are absolutely exceptional with the score. Can You Hear the Music is a great track. It's brilliant. And overall, I do think the score adds a lot to the movie in terms of tension, in terms of building emotion, building atmosphere. But there's something that I find just a little cheesy about the score, which is I think Ludwig Göransson's approach to the score is very interesting, how he balances the analog sounds of the strings with the electronic sounds, which is like, you know, he's talking about technical progress even in the music, because, you know, this is a story about discovering the atom bomb, building the atom bomb, and what he's doing is taking these analog sounds and then building in electronics, building in synths. I just find the way that he uses synths to sound a little bit cheesy at times. And sometimes I do find that the music becomes a bit too much of a wall of sound. Like, it never gives you a moment to breathe. And at times it can just feel a little bit like noise. But again, there are so many beautiful tracks in this. I think Can You Hear the Music is amazing. I wish I had the Spotify track list, because I just listened to the score a couple of days ago. But there are a few other songs in this where I'm like, that is cinema. That is beautiful. But overall, I don't know. I find it a little bit more noisy than anything.
Well, Matt, I just don't like your phrase because I think this score is just great. I think in addition to the Can You Hear the Music, the Trinity Test song is another standout. The final track as well. And then I really like, especially on this rewatch, Dr. Hill's theme, Rami Malek's character, that comes in when he is introduced later on in the film. That, like, I'm not going to try to replicate the noise here, but like, I don't know. I just really like how that track kind of comes off. But another area I know that we are going to disagree pretty strongly on, Matt, is going to be cinematography, because Hoyt Van Hoytema is one of my favorite working cinematographers currently. I think it's just so crisp here. The color sequences are fantastic, but the black and white of the film is really the standout to me. I think it looks so clear. It's very distinctive, and with it lacking color, it's still very eye-popping, which I think is something that most black and white movies don't have. Look at Mank. I think the cinematography is great, but it's not eye-popping to me, where here, the black and white is the eye-popping nature of the cinematography.
It's the film. That's what it is.
And I think that ties into the editing, too, because so much of aiding the audience through all the time jumps is the black and white versus the color, helping you differentiate the two different timelines. And I mean, the fact that they had to invent a whole new IMAX stock for the 70mm black and white is impressive in its own right.
That's Matt's favorite point.
Oh, it's my favorite point. I hate that I sound so negative. I have to clarify again. This is a good movie. I give it a decent 8 out of 10.
That's how I feel about
like
holdovers.
Oppenheimer. I know, but it's so hard when talking about a movie that like has so much potential. If it's just like, it's very good. You know, I always end up coming off like a hater on movies that I actually do quite like. I think the cinematography is good, is what I'll say. It is well done. It does the job it needs to. I do think that the black and white moments are some of the highlights, mostly because of how it captures shadow on their faces. Especially there's a moment in the cab with Robert Downey Jr. where there's light shining in from behind him, and the way that it puts a line very, very clearly across his face is so beautifully done. That is one of the most stunning shots out there. But that said, I do find a lot of the movie to just it looks good. It doesn't look exceptional in a way that I want out of a best cinematography winner. It is great cinematography, but it's not exceptional in my mind. It's the same way with Top Gun last year. I was like, it never made sense as a critic frontrunner to me, because I was like, yeah, it looks great, but there's nothing that makes it stand out above everything else. Whereas looking at something like Poor Things, the lens choices, the vibrancy in the colors, the lighting design, I think is so stunning. But again, we're not talking about Poor Things, we're talking about Oppenheimer, and it's well done.
I guess how you feel about cinematography is kind of how I feel about Oppenheimer's other technical nominations, where they're very good work, but they're not jumping out of the page to me, those being costume design, makeup and hairstyling, and production design. Production design is the one I'll talk about here a little bit because I think it's the best of the bunch. It's like Killers of the Flower Moon. You're completely recreating a historical city, doing it not entirely from scratch, but from photographical evidence. And I just think the way that they were able to go about it, especially the timeliness, if you know like the backstory of how quickly they made these sets for the film, they came in under budget for them as well to allow more money to go to visual effects, go to the actors, and make the production stay on schedule, I think is a very underappreciated aspect of the craft. But yeah, these 3 nominations I think are very good work. I'm happy for the nominations, but they're not ones like, oh yeah, I need this to win sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. I will say on this rewatch, the makeup work impressed me a little bit more than it did the first time, because, you know, Cillian Murphy especially, he's playing Oppenheimer from the age of like early 20s to like, I don't know, 60 or 70 in that final flashback scene, and they really help delineate that with all the makeup on his face. It helps him feel older as the film progresses, and especially the scene with Gary Oldman as Truman. Man, that makeup work is very impressive. Like, I did not realize it was him until about halfway through that scene.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. And to talk about like the editing, what we were saying earlier about how, you know, you can keep track of how like everyone of how you can keep track of where in the timeline we are. That's also in the cinematography, and it's in the makeup. You know, it has the ability to cut to the past, to the future, because the makeup is so clear. Where are we in the story? Like, when is this happening? And just by looking at Cillian Murphy, we can know, oh, that this is when this is happening. This is after. This is before. So that's really strong. I do think the old age makeup definitely looks a little bit weaker on this watch than it did before for me. That one flash forward scene, it's a little bit weaker. Now, that said, costumes, this was one that I know I denied for most of the year. I was like, there's no way this happens. No way it gets a costume nomination. It's just men in suits. And it is men in suits, but I think there is something to be said for how iconic the look that they build for Oppenheimer is, with the hat, with the cigarette, with the suit, the specific type of suit, the way it hangs open. Is the costume work exceptional? No, but it works. It does the job. And sometimes that is enough to get you a nomination.
Like, how many people did we see dress up as Oppenheimer for Halloween? Like, there's something to be said for that. And just the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon, people dressing up in the theater, wearing pink, and then changing into the suits and the hat. Like, people got into it, and I think that is because of the iconic costume design for Oppenheimer specifically.
Oppenheimer basically got every nomination it was eligible for. One it missed out on is probably because it missed the shortlist being visual effects. And this is a category that I think is always really weird to talk about, because you kind of have to go off of the shortlist to talk about what was actually realistically possible. Because, like, obviously the creator has great visual effects. I really like Napoleon and Guardian of the Galaxy and Indiana Jones. But then it leaves like a fifth slot, and like, yeah, Godzilla's cool. I think it looks kind of wonky. I know it was made for $15 million, but it looks like it was made for significantly less. Spider-Verse, I think the story behind it is cool, but also, at least for me, being someone who's not the most knowledgeable for visual effects, there's nothing about this film that jumps out compared to some other animated films to be like, oh, this is the one that we have to single out compared to the others. And Poor Things has the cool set extensions, but is that enough for a nomination? So that kind of leaves Oppenheimer as like a potential candidate. But one that didn't make the short list I think is really good is Gran Turismo. Movie's not that good, but the visual effects I think are really, really good. So like, it kind of just comes down to, how do you judge visual effects? Is it from movies you like? Do you like the big bold stuff? Do you like the more subtle stuff? So I get why some people were clamoring for this nomination. I get why some people were so upset that it was even considered. I kind of fall in, if it happened, cool. If it didn't, I'm not overtly upset.
Yeah, I mean, I do admire Nolan's penchant for doing everything in camera and doing everything with practical effects, but I do wish that he had broken that rule a little bit with this movie, because the bomb scene didn't quite do it for me. Like, you can tell it's like a gas explosion, like, that you really needed to feel the grandeur, and like I'm a little bit of a history junkie when it comes to the atomic bomb, and like just the scale of, but like that's where the real terror of those weapons comes in, and you didn't quite feel that in the movie, in my opinion.
I completely agree with you, and I shit-talked the possibility of a visual effects nomination all year long. Every time we mention it, I was like, get fucking real. This is absurd. It's one explosion. But after this watch, I'm going to be honest, I'm coming around to the visual effects, and I would actually say it would be one of my nominees, but that has nothing to do with that explosion. I think the explosion is the weakest visual effect in the movie for the reasons that you said, Austin. It doesn't have the same scope, and it looks like a gas fire. You can see the gas burning, the plumes of smoke coming off of it. It does not look like a mushroom cloud. I worked in a job as a research assistant on a documentary, which is about the Cold War and the development of nuclear weapons. And I watched hours and hours worth of mushroom clouds during this job. This didn't do it for me. It didn't quite work. But there are a few things that I loved about the visual effects on this watch, which is the way that they represented quantum physics, the way that they represented these things in his mind. Yes, those are all very simple effects. You know, Stanley Kubrick did all of that and more in 1968, just in the one sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where it's like outer space, and it's, you know, you've got the steel wool, you've got all of the different things. But what I really like in visual effects is when you're representing things creatively, when you're thinking outside of the box to try and represent abstract concepts. And I really do think they did a good job with finding out how to represent that. That, and there's a few shots at the end with the Earth being engulfed in flames, the rockets coming through the clouds that I think are so beautifully done. It might not be the most visual effects, but when there is visual effects, it's really, really well done. As well as I love those moments where the wall starts to shift behind him, and all it is a projection that they're using, and they're just shaking the projector. It's so simple, but it's really effective, and it looks great. So yes, while I railed against this nomination all year long, I am coming around to it. I will never say that the bomb looks great in this, but every other visual effect in the movie does look very good.
Well, I kind of want to say "told you so" because all year long I was like, "It's not for the bomb. It's for quantum mechanics." Bah! But I'm glad that you came around.
And I've been saying, like, yeah, it's not impressive, and it's not impressive. All of these things, like, with a couple days practice, you could probably recreate any of these effects, but it's the creativity in them. They're very creative.
Yep. I was going to say, like, there were a lot of YouTubers who were like, oh, we recreated all these in, like, 30 minutes. And it's like, it's not about the difficulty so much as how he uses it to convey Oppenheimer's inner thoughts and the way he looks at the world. Like, the spinning electrons and the stars. And, like, yeah, anyone could recreate it, but that's not the point. It's the visual manifestation of his... Yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
no, I kept interrupting you. I'm so sorry. It's even just like the thought process of like, how do we represent these things visually? You know, it's a cool choice, but like it's less how hard is it to do and more how accurately does it represent it, and does it click in your mind of like, this is what it's supposed to be. And I think it does that really, really well. So yeah, is it hard to do? No, but you know, I can't have the double standard of, you know, last year I was supporting Everything Ever All at Once getting a visual effects nomination. Are those the most polished effects? No, but they're creative. And that was my argument all year long. They might not be polished, but they are really well thought out. And Oppenheimer is polished. It's well thought out. There's just not much of them. But I feel like I'd be hypocritical if I didn't say that they're creative. And that's what I like.
So that's going to bring us to what I think is one of the most fun parts of these revisiting episodes. It's hearing our guest preferential ballot, ranking all 10 Best Picture nominees. And Austin, I'm assuming Oppenheimer is not going to be number 10. So what will be number 10 in your list?
It's not my number 10, no. My number 10, well, I'll say first of all, I think this is a very good lineup. Like, I would say, other than my number 10, I did enjoy all these films, so just keep that in mind. But my number 10 is Maestro, unfortunately. Like, I'm not going to rag on it too much, but it just didn't work for me. Like, say whatever you will about the acting, but just, it was the story, mostly, that bothered me. It didn't really give me what I was looking for. So my number 9 is Killers of the Flower Moon, another one where the script kind of let me down a little bit. Like, everything about the crafts and the acting is perfect, in my opinion, but that script, again, I just think they chose the least interesting way to tell that story, through the perspective of the killers rather than through Molly, which would have been a much more interesting film, in my opinion. My number 8 is American Fiction, which I do wish I'd seen it at a festival without seeing the trailer first, because I think the trailer kind of ruined a lot of the jokes and one-liners, but I do think it's very clever and well-written, and I want to see Jeffrey Wright in more films. My number 7 is Past Lives, which I admired. Like, I think Celine Song does a great job with the direction of the movie. Just personally, like, I don't have the life experience yet to really connect emotionally with it on that level, but I think I'll probably go back to that movie in 10, 20 years, and it could impact me a lot differently then. My number 6 is Barbie, which gets a little bit of a boost just for the Barbenheimer experience. This is one of my favorite movie-going experiences ever. I think it works best when it's not really taking itself too seriously, when it's just, you know, being silly and song and dance, but the last, like, 15-20 minutes didn't quite do it for me. But I still think it's one of the best studio comedies we've gotten in a while. My number 5 is Poor Things. One of my favorite reviews of Poor Things was it's basically Barbie if Barbie had genitals, which I think is awesome and pretty true, but I think it's probably my favorite Lanthimos movie from a visual standpoint. It looks incredible. I probably prefer The Favorite a little bit in terms of the script, but I still think it's really well done. Emma Stone gives my favorite performance of the year. My number 4 is The Zone of Interest, which I've only seen once. I saw it like about a month ago, and I do want to see it again before I kind of solidify how I feel about it. It's a very frustrating watch, but obviously intentionally so. It makes you really think about the way that we consume media about tragedies like the Holocaust, and I think I wouldn't quite call it a masterpiece yet, but I can see myself getting there in the future. My number 3 is The Holdovers, which is just a lovely comfort watch. I can see myself going back to it every holiday season, and just a really classic throwback script, not only because it's, you know, set in the 70s and has that feel, but just the classic, you know, 3 character arcs intertwining and these broken people finding each other. I thought it was lovely. My number 2 is Anatomy of a Fall, which I just watched your guys' video you did with Arno about this one, and I like something you said, Matt, about how it's less about her being put on trial for the murder and more about her relationship being put on trial and being dissected in front of the world. Kind of similar to Oppenheimer in that way, actually, where her whole life is being put on display and being analyzed by strangers. And I think it's my favorite screenplay of the year, and Sandra Hüller is great in it, and Snoop the dog, best animal performance of the year, hands down.
Snoop.
But my number 1, for all the reasons we just said, Oppenheimer. I would still probably put The Dark Knight and Inception above it in terms of Christopher Nolan movies, but it's my favorite movie of the year. It was my favorite movie of the decade until about a couple days ago, but that's a discussion for next year's Oscars.
Oh yeah, we'll have to have you back for that one.
That's going to bring us to the conclusion of this revisiting episode talking about Oppenheimer. For everyone out there, if you made it this far, consider subscribing, dropping us a like, commenting your top 10 preferential ballot down below, because in like a day or two, we're going to be posting all of our guest rankings put together, as well as Matt and my own, to see which film comes out on top for the Fantasy Filmball Oscars. But until then, my name's Dyl.
My name's Matt, and of course, that's Austin. Thank you so much for joining us, my dude. And this has been Fantasy Filmball.